Naomi Spencer clutched the worn leather strap of her carry-on bag as she navigated the bustling airport terminal. The hum of announcements blended with the faint murmur of passengers exchanging quiet conversation. She moved deliberately, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each step a small defiance of the exhaustion weighing on her shoulders. Another business trip, another week of meetings, presentations, and smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. The gate was crowded. As usual, Naomi glanced at the screen above her flight 247 to Dallas. Delayed by 20 minutes. She let out a soft sigh and lowered herself into an empty seat. Careful not to bump the older man dozing next to her, she reached for her phone, scrolling absent-mindedly through emails she had no intention of answering just yet. The boarding process was still a while off when the familiar announcement crackled over the speakers. Good evening, passengers. We are pleased to offer complimentary upgrades to business class for eligible travelers. Please approach the counter if you would like to check your status. Naomi sat up a little straighter. Her airline membership card was tucked safely in her wallet, marked with the gold tier emblem that promised exclusive perks and privileges. She had earned it through countless hours in the air, a perk of her relentless work schedule. Her gaze drifted toward the counter, where a small line was beginning to form. A middle-aged man in a navy blazer stepped forward, smiling broadly as the agent confirmed his upgrade. A younger woman followed, her designer tote dangling from one arm, her face lighting up as she accepted her new boarding pass. Naomi hesitated. She had been here before. Not just in this airport, but in this exact moment. It wasn't that she expected to be denied outright. That would be too blatant. Too obvious. It was something quieter, more insidious, a pattern she had noticed over time. Her fingers tightened around the armrest of her seat. She wasn't imagining it, was she? The men in suits, the women with sleek ponytails and tailored blouses, they always seemed to get called first. People who didn't look like her. People whose presence didn't cause the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the barely perceptible stiffening of spines. Maybe this time, she murmured to herself, standing and smoothing the wrinkles in her trousers. The line had thinned by the time Naomi approached the counter. The agent, a young woman with a professional smile, glanced at Naomi's card and tapped a few keys on her computer. There was a pause, brief but distinct, before the smile returned. Unfortunately, we don't have any upgrades available at the moment. Please enjoy your flight. Naomi nodded, her expression unreadable. Thank you, she said, stepping aside as another passenger approached. She made her way back to her seat, the weight of the interaction settling over her like a familiar coat. She had heard that phrase before, spoken in the same neutral tone, wrapped in the same thin veneer of courtesy. She wasn't surprised, not really, yet there was a quiet sting to it, like the faint ache of an old wound that had never quite healed. As she settled into her seat in the economy cabin later, Naomi let her eyes wander across the rows of passengers being ushered into business class. She recognized some of the faces from the gate, men and women with confident strides. Their upgrades secured without hesitation. She leaned her head against the window, closing her eyes as the plane began its taxi to the runway. The flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard. Naomi tuned it out, her thoughts drifting. It wasn't anger she felt. Not exactly. It was more like resignation, a quiet acknowledgement of a truth she didn't have the energy to fight in that moment. As the plane lifted into the sky, she made a mental note to document the experience in the journal she had been keeping. Not for anyone else, but for herself. A record of the small, unspoken slights that added up over time, like raindrops wearing away at stone. She opened her eyes briefly, watching the city lights fade into darkness below. Another flight. Another story. The hum of the plane was a low, steady presence, blending seamlessly with the occasional rustle of passengers settling into their seats. Naomi shifted slightly, adjusting her tray table to give herself a little more space. It wasn't much, but enough to remind her that comfort here was rationed carefully, doled out only to those seated a few rows ahead. She glanced toward the thin curtain separating economy from business class. It wasn't fully drawn, leaving just enough of a gap for her to see glimpses of the passengers in their larger seats. leaning back with glasses of wine or steaming cups of coffee. The curtain swayed gently, as if mocking the illusion of separation. It wasn't a wall, just fabric on a rod. Yet it felt as solid as stone. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, handing out drinks and snacks to passengers. When one stopped at Naomi's row, she smiled politely and asked for water. The woman handed it to her with a pleasant nod. The same smile she had given to the man across the aisle moments earlier. And yet, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else, something quieter. Almost imperceptible. Perhaps it was the way the flight attendant's gaze didn't linger, moving past Naomi as though she were just another task to complete. Or maybe it was the way her tone had shifted. Warmer for the man with the laptop who had asked for coffee. Just slightly more neutral when she addressed Naomi. It wasn't enough to accuse, but it was enough to notice. Naomi sipped her water and leaned back, letting her eyes wander the cabin. The couple in front of her was sharing a bag of pretzels. Their conversation too low to hear. To her left, a young woman in headphones was scrolling through a playlist on her phone. It was all so ordinary, so mundane, and yet, beneath it, Naomi felt the same familiar undercurrent, the sense that everything was happening just slightly differently for her. Her thoughts drifted back to the gate, to the moment when the agent had told her there were no upgrades available. She had noticed the brief hesitation, the flicker of something in the woman's expression before the polished smile returned. It wasn't overt, nothing anyone else would have caught. But Naomi had seen it before, in countless interactions that followed the same subtle script. She closed her eyes, letting the drone of the engines fill her ears. It wasn't about the seat. She reminded herself. It wasn't about legroom or priority boarding or the small glass of champagne she might have been handed if she had been sitting up front. It was about what the seat represented: a validation, a quiet acknowledgement that she belonged in a space so often reserved for others. When she opened her eyes again, the flight attendant was making her way back up the aisle. This time, Naomi caught her eye and offered a small smile. The woman hesitated, just for a moment, before returning it. It wasn't much, but it felt like something: a crack in the veneer, a tiny opening in the wall that separated them. The man sitting next to Naomi shifted in his seat, glancing at her briefly before looking away. He hadn't spoken since they boarded, but she could feel his discomfort in the way he avoided meeting her gaze. It was the same unease she had felt in offices and waiting rooms and elevators. A quiet tension that settled in the air whenever her presence was unexpected. Naomi turned her attention to the book in her lap, flipping to the page where she had left off. The words blurred slightly as her mind wandered again, but she forced herself to focus, determined to lose herself in the story for a while. The plane jolted slightly as it hit a patch of turbulence, and Naomi tightened her grip on the armrest. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and reassuring. As the cabin settled again, Naomi exhaled slowly, her pulse evening out with the rhythm of the engines. As the flight attendant passed by again, Naomi caught her eye once more. "Thank you," she said softly, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking her for. The woman paused, her expression softening just enough to make Naomi wonder if she had noticed the way the world moved differently for some than it did for others. But then she nodded and walked away, and the moment passed as quickly as it had come. Naomi leaned her head against the window, watching the faint glow of the horizon in the distance. The city lights were long gone, replaced by the vast, endless dark of the sky. She let her thoughts drift again, trying not to hold on too tightly to the questions swirling in her mind. It wasn't about the seat, she reminded herself again, but even as the words settled in her heart, she couldn't help but wonder why it still mattered so much. The Dallas terminal was sprawling, a mix of fluorescent lights and endless corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity. Naomi walked briskly, her carry-on rolling smoothly behind her. She wasn't late for her next flight, not yet, but she didn't want to linger. Airports were a strange liminal space, where time seemed to move differently, where people brushed past each other with neither acknowledgement nor connection. She spotted the next gate ahead and let out a small breath of relief. It was quieter here, less crowded. She found an empty seat near the window and sank into it, her hands resting in her lap. Outside, planes taxied across the tarmac, their lights blinking in the fading evening glow. Naomi pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her notes. Over the past year, she had started documenting moments like the one at the gate earlier. Not every instance, not every slight, there were too many for that. But the ones that stood out. The ones that left her with a lingering sense of unease. She recorded. Her entries weren't dramatic. She had no interest in exaggerating or embellishing, that wasn't the point. Instead, she wrote them as plainly as possible. Like a scientist recording observations. Each entry was a puzzle piece. Part of a larger picture she was still trying to understand. Today's entry would be no different. Flight 247. Gold status. Checked for upgrade availability. Denied. Observed others upgraded at the counter. No clear reason for exclusion. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. What else could she add? What words would capture the brief pause and the agent's smile? The quiet certainty that her eligibility wasn't the issue? Naomi sighed and closed the app. Some things were too subtle to explain. Even to herself. As she slipped her phone back into her bag, a voice interrupted her thoughts. You were on the flight from Atlanta, weren't you? Naomi looked up to see a man standing a few feet away. He was tall, with neatly combed hair and the kind of tailored suit that spoke of boardrooms and power lunches. She recognized him from earlier, the man who had been upgraded to business class without hesitation. Yes, I was, Naomi replied, her voice even. The man smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Small world, I thought I saw you at the gate earlier. He gestured toward the seat beside her. Mind if I join you? Naomi nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she wanted company. The man sat down, adjusting his briefcase and crossing one leg over the other. I'm Oliver, he said, extending a hand. Naomi, she replied, shaking it briefly. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the airport filling the space between them. Finally, Oliver spoke again. You travel a lot, don't you? I noticed your gold card earlier. Naomi nodded. I do. It comes with the job. What do you do? He asked. His tone casual but curious. Marketing, she said. I handle client accounts for a tech company. Impressive, Oliver said, nodding. I work in finance myself. Travel all the time, though it's not as glamorous as it sounds. He chuckled, as if they shared some unspoken joke about the drudgery of frequent travel. Naomi offered a polite smile but didn't respond. She wasn't sure where this conversation was going. And she didn't feel like filling the silence with small talk. Oliver shifted slightly, his expression turning more serious. You know, he began. I couldn't help but notice something earlier. At the gate, you were in line for the upgrade. Weren't you? Naomi's gaze flicked to him. Her expression carefully neutral. I was, she said simply. Oliver hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. It's strange, isn't it? How they decide who gets upgraded. You'd think it would be straightforward. Based on status or points or something like that. You'd think, Naomi replied, her tone measured. Oliver leaned back in his seat, his brow furrowing slightly. I've always assumed it's just luck of the draw. But, he trailed off, glancing at Naomi as though waiting for her to fill in the blank. Naomi met his gaze evenly. But sometimes it doesn't feel random, she said, her voice calm but pointed. Oliver's lips pressed into a thin line. I suppose I've never really thought about it, he admitted after a moment. I mean, I've always gotten the upgrade when I've been eligible. Guess I just assumed it worked that way for everyone. Naomi let the silence linger, her eyes returning to the tarmac outside. She wasn't sure what to say to someone who had never had to question the fairness of a system because it had always worked in their favor. It must be nice, she said finally, her tone soft but steady. Oliver looked at her, confusion flickering across his face. What do you mean? Naomi turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. To not have to think about it. To assume the system is fair because it's always been fair to you. Oliver opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. He looked away, his discomfort palpable. Naomi felt a faint pang of satisfaction, though it was tempered by the weight of the moment. She stood, slinging her bag over her shoulder. It was nice meeting you, Oliver, she said, her voice polite but firm. He nodded, his expression unreadable. You too, Naomi. As she walked toward the gate, Naomi felt a strange mix of emotions: frustration, resignation, and a quiet resolve. It wasn't her job to explain the world to Oliver. But maybe, just maybe, their conversation had planted a seed. Outside, the sky was darkening, the last traces of sunlight fading into the horizon. Naomi took a deep breath and stepped onto the jet bridge, ready for whatever the next flight might bring. The office was small but neatly arranged, with bookshelves lining one wall and a desk that looked well used but carefully maintained. Naomi sat across from Rachel Connor, a journalist she'd met a few weeks ago at a networking event. Rachel had the kind of demeanor that put people at ease: a warm smile, attentive eyes, and a voice that carried a quiet authority. She had been writing about travel for years, but recently, her focus had shifted toward exposing the inequalities embedded in the industry. "Thanks for meeting me," Naomi said, setting her cup of coffee on the table between them. "Of course," Rachel replied, leaning forward slightly. "You sounded like you had a story worth digging into." Naomi hesitated for a moment, unsure of where to begin. It wasn't that she lacked stories to tell; her journal was full of them, but explaining what it felt like to navigate a system that seemed designed to ignore her wasn't easy. Still, Rachel had listened carefully when they first spoke, and something about her made Naomi feel she could trust her. "It's not just one incident," Naomi began, her voice steady. "It's a pattern. Every time I travel, it feels like I'm reminded, in small ways, that the rules don't work the same for everyone." Rachel nodded, her pen poised over a notebook. "Can you give me an example?" Naomi thought back to her last flight. "Take upgrades," she said. "I have gold status with my airline. I've flown hundreds of thousands of miles with them. And technically, I qualify for complimentary upgrades. But I almost never get them." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Never?" "Almost never," Naomi clarified. "I see other passengers, people who don't seem to have higher status, getting called for upgrades. I can't prove it, but after a while, you start to notice patterns. The people getting upgraded don't look like me." Rachel's pen scratched against the paper. "And you think it's deliberate?" Naomi hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I don't think it's as simple as someone at the counter deciding I don't deserve the seat. It's more subtle than that. Maybe it's unconscious bias. Maybe it's something built into the system, an algorithm or a policy that prioritizes certain passengers over others." Rachel nodded thoughtfully. "Have you tried asking the airline about it?" Naomi smiled faintly. "I have. They give you the same answer every time: something about availability or the system being random. But it's not random. Not really." Rachel leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "This isn't the first time I've heard about something like this," she said. "I've been looking into how airlines handle upgrades, seating assignments, even security screenings. There's a lot of room for bias to creep in. And most people don't even realize it's happening." She paused, tapping her pen against the edge of her notebook. "Would you be willing to share more details? I'm trying to build a larger picture. And your experiences could help." Naomi nodded. "I've been keeping a journal," she admitted, "documenting the things that stand out, the moments that feel off." Rachel's eyes lit up. "That could be incredibly useful. Would you mind sharing some of it with me?" Naomi hesitated. Her journal was personal, a record of her quiet frustrations and reflections. But she had come here for a reason. And Rachel seemed genuinely committed to uncovering the truth. "I'll send you some entries," Naomi said finally. "The ones that seem relevant." Rachel smiled. "Thank you. I think this could be the start of something important." For the next hour, they discussed Naomi's experiences in more detail. Rachel asked thoughtful questions, probing gently but never pushing too hard. Naomi found herself opening up more than she had expected, sharing stories she hadn't even realized she'd been holding onto. As their conversation wound down, Rachel leaned forward, her expression serious. "You're not alone in this," she said. "I've talked to other travelers, people of color, women, passengers with disabilities. They've all noticed the same kinds of things. It's like the system was built for a certain kind of traveler. And everyone else is just an afterthought." Naomi nodded, her chest tightening at the validation. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't alone. Rachel continued. "I want to dig deeper into this. I'm thinking of writing a series, something that lays it all out. From the policies to the personal stories. But it's going to take time. And I'll need your help. Naomi met her gaze, feeling a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. I'll do what I can, she said. They stood to leave, and Rachel walked Naomi to the door. Thank you for trusting me with this, Rachel said. I'll keep you updated on what I find. Naomi nodded, gripping the strap of her bag tightly. Thank you for listening. As she walked back to her car, Naomi felt the weight of her stories shifting. Just slightly. They were still hers. But now they were part of something bigger, a mosaic of experiences that might finally reveal the truth hidden in the cracks. The evening air was cool as she stepped outside, the sky fading into shades of gray and blue. Naomi took a deep breath, her thoughts a quiet mix of apprehension and resolve. For the first time in a long time, she felt like her voice might actually be heard. The office was quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioner. Naomi sat across from James Miller, her manager, in a chair that was just slightly too low for the desk in front of her. James was reviewing something on his tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration. The room smelled faintly of coffee and the faint tang of recycled air. Naomi had rehearsed this conversation in her mind several times. She had chosen her words carefully, crafting them to be clear but not confrontational. Still, as she sat there, waiting for James to finish scrolling through his screen, a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. Finally, James looked up. He was a man in his late 50s, with a neatly trimmed beard and an air of casual authority. Sorry about that, he said, setting the tablet down. What's on your mind, Naomi? Naomi shifted slightly in her seat, clasping her hands together. I wanted to talk about something that's been affecting me during my business travel. James leaned back, folding his arms. Go on. She took a breath. It's about how I've been treated specifically by the airline we use. I've noticed a pattern in how upgrades and seating arrangements are handled. Despite my frequent flyer status, I'm consistently overlooked for upgrades, even when I meet the criteria. James frowned slightly. Are you sure it's not just bad luck? These things are usually random, aren't they? It's not random, Naomi said, her voice calm but firm. I've documented enough instances to see a pattern. I can't help but notice that the passengers who are prioritized don't look like me. James's expression shifted, part surprise, part discomfort. Naomi, are you suggesting this is about race? I'm suggesting that there's a bias in how the system operates, Naomi replied. Whether it's intentional or not, the result is the same. It's a subtle reminder, every time I travel, that I'm not seen as belonging in certain spaces. James exhaled, rubbing his temples. Look, I understand this is frustrating. But is this really something you want to focus on? You're one of the top performers in the team. And I don't want you getting distracted by something that might just be perception. Naomi held his gaze, her calm demeanor masking the flicker of frustration she felt. It's not just perception, she said, and it's not just about me. This kind of bias, subtle as it is, has an impact. It affects how I'm able to do my job, how I'm seen by clients, and how much energy I have left after every trip. James sighed, leaning forward. I'm not saying this doesn't matter, Naomi, but the airline's policies are out of our control. Maybe you should focus on what you can change, rather than worrying about things you can't. Naomi paused, letting his words hang in the air. She had expected some level of pushback, but the ease with which James dismissed her concerns stung more than she anticipated. It's not just about changing policies, she said quietly. It's about acknowledging that there's a problem. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away. James studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. I hear you, he said finally, but my advice? Focus on the work. You're doing great things here, and I'd hate to see this become a distraction. Naomi nodded, though her mind was far from settled. Thank you for your time, she said, rising to her feet. As she walked back to her desk, the conversation replayed in her mind, each word echoing with a sharper edge. James hadn't been overtly dismissive, his tone had been polite, even understanding, but his reluctance to engage with her concerns felt like a door quietly closing in her face. Back at her desk, Naomi opened her laptop and stared at the screen. The spreadsheet in front of her blurred slightly as her thoughts drifted. She had done what she could. Raised her concerns to someone with more power than she had. But instead of feeling relieved, she felt the same weight pressing down on her, the same quiet resignation she carried after every denied upgrade. Every subtle slight that went unacknowledged. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Rachel. Just got some interesting data from another source. Let's talk soon. Naomi stared at the message for a moment. Then typed a quick reply. Let me know when. She closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, gazing out the window. The sky was a pale, indifferent gray, clouds drifting lazily across it. Naomi felt small in that moment, like a single raindrop in a vast storm. But she reminded herself that storms didn't form from one drop, they formed from many, gathering strength until they could no longer be ignored. She didn't know what Rachel had found, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not yet. The flight was uneventful, at least on the surface. Passengers shuffled quietly through the narrow aisles. Overhead bins clicked shut, and the steady hum of the engines filled the cabin. Naomi sat near the window, her journal tucked into the seat pocket in front of her. She hadn't written anything yet. Instead, she stared out at the tarmac as the plane taxied toward the runway. Her thoughts swirling. Across the aisle, a flight attendant was handing a pre-departure drink to a man in the business class section. She moved with practiced efficiency, her smile warm and professional. Naomi recognized her instantly. Clara, the same attendant she had spoken to months ago on another flight. Their previous conversation had been brief but revealing. Clara's words laced with an unspoken understanding of the world Naomi was navigating. As the plane climbed into the sky, Naomi found herself watching Clara's movements. There was something steadying about her presence. The way she seemed to glide through the cabin with quiet authority. When Clara reached Naomi's row, their eyes met for a brief moment. Anything for you? Clara asked, her tone as neutral as the hum of the engines. Just water, Naomi replied. Clara nodded, disappearing toward the galley. When she returned, she leaned in slightly as she handed Naomi the water. It's good to see you again, she said softly, her smile just a little more genuine than before. Naomi blinked, surprised that Clara had remembered her. You too, she managed, her voice low. Clara straightened and moved on to the next passenger. But something about the interaction lingered. It wasn't just the recognition, it was the sense that, in a space where Naomi often felt invisible, someone had noticed her. Blank. Blank. Later in the flight, after the meal service was completed and the cabin lights dimmed, Clara reappeared. She paused by Naomi's row, glancing around as if to make sure no one was paying attention. Do you mind if I sit for a moment? Clara asked, gesturing to the empty seat beside Naomi. Not at all, Naomi replied, intrigued. Clara slid into the seat, folding her hands in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet murmur of other passengers filled the space between them. I remember our last conversation, Clara began, her voice low but steady. You mentioned feeling like the system isn't designed for people like you. Naomi nodded. I've been thinking about it a lot since then. Clara hesitated, as if weighing her words. I've been working for this airline for over a decade. I've seen patterns that most people don't notice. Or maybe they notice but don't want to acknowledge. Like what? Naomi asked, her curiosity piqued. Clara glanced down the aisle before continuing. Like how certain passengers are always treated a little better. How the random upgrades rarely feel random. And how people like you, well, let's just say the odds aren't always in your favor. Naomi leaned back, her pulse quickening. It wasn't news to her. But hearing it confirmed by someone on the inside felt validating in a way she hadn't expected. Why are you telling me this? Naomi asked. Clara looked at her, her expression earnest. Because it's not right. And because I think people like you deserve to know that you're not imagining it. The system is flawed, deeply flawed. But most people don't want to talk about it. Naomi's mind raced. Have you ever brought this up to anyone? Management? A supervisor? Clara laughed softly, a sound that carried no real humor. Do you think they'd listen? I'd risk my job for nothing. The only way things change is if someone from the outside pushes back. Naomi considered this. She thought about Rachel's investigation. The stories they had pieced together. The data that was starting to form a picture of systemic bias. "There's a journalist I've been working with," she said. "She's digging into these issues, trying to expose how widespread they are." Clara's eyes lit up. That's what it's going to take, people willing to shine a light on what's been hiding in the shadows. "If there's anything I can do to help, let me know." Naomi smiled. A small but genuine expression of gratitude. "Thank you. I'll let Rachel know. Your perspective could make a real difference." Clara nodded. Standing as another flight attendant appeared at the end of the aisle. "I should get back to work," she said, "but I'm glad we talked." Naomi watched her go, a sense of quiet determination settling over her. Clara's words had confirmed what she already knew. But they also gave her something more, a sense of solidarity. A reminder that she wasn't fighting this battle alone. Blank. Blank. As the plane descended toward its destination, Naomi pulled out her journal and began to write. She documented everything Clara had said. Every observation that might help Rachel build her case. The words flowed easily now. The act of writing no longer just a personal exercise but part of something bigger. When the plane touched down and passengers began gathering their belongings, Naomi felt a flicker of hope. It was small and fragile, but it was there, burning quietly against the backdrop of a system that had tried so hard to extinguish it. As she stepped off the plane, Naomi glanced back one last time. Clara was standing near the cockpit, her smile warm and knowing. Naomi returned it with a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared understanding. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, Naomi felt like she was gaining altitude. The room was small but functional, its plain walls and long conference table illuminated by the cold light of fluorescent fixtures. Naomi sat at one end, a folder of documents in front of her, while Rachel Connor prepared her notes. Across from them sat two representatives from the airline, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit and a younger woman with a clipboard. Their expressions were neutral but guarded, as if bracing for a conversation they'd rather avoid. Rachel began, her tone calm and professional. "Thank you for meeting with us today. As I mentioned in my correspondence, we've gathered evidence suggesting a consistent pattern of bias in your airline's upgrade and seating policies. We're here to share our findings and discuss potential solutions." The man leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. "We take these kinds of concerns seriously," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "But I'd like to emphasize that our systems are designed to ensure fairness and efficiency. If there have been individual cases of dissatisfaction, we're happy to address them." Naomi bit back the urge to respond immediately, letting Rachel take the lead. "What we've found goes beyond individual cases," Rachel said, sliding a stack of documents across the table. "These are records from passengers' frequent flyers, like Naomi here, detailing repeated instances of being overlooked for upgrades despite meeting all eligibility criteria. When you compare this to the demographic data of those who did receive upgrades, a clear pattern emerges." The younger woman flipped through the documents, her expression unreadable. The man, however, maintained a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I see you've done your homework," he said, "but correlation doesn't equal causation. There could be many reasons for these discrepancies: availability, timing, even random chance." Naomi spoke up, her voice steady but firm. "I've been flying with your airline for years. I've documented every flight, every interaction. This isn't about chance. It's about a system that consistently favors certain passengers while marginalizing others." The man's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Ms. Spencer, I assure you, our policies are designed to be impartial. If you've experienced anything that suggests otherwise, it's purely coincidental." Naomi held his gaze, refusing to back down. "Coincidence doesn't happen this often. Blank. Blank." As the meeting continued, the tension in the room grew thicker. Rachel presented more evidence, testimonies from other passengers, internal policies obtained through anonymous sources, even a statistical analysis showing clear disparities. Each point was met with polite deflection from the airline representatives, their answers carefully crafted to avoid admitting fault. But Naomi noticed something else. 2. A flicker of unease in their expressions. The slightest hesitation in their responses. They knew, she realized, maybe they hadn't intended for the system to be biased. But they had seen the results and chosen to ignore them. And now, faced with evidence they couldn't easily dismiss, their carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. The younger woman spoke up for the first time. If I may, she said, glancing at her colleague, I think it's worth considering whether there are areas where our policies could be improved. Even if there's no intentional bias. Perception matters. The man shot her a sharp look but didn't interrupt. Rachel seized the opportunity. Exactly. This isn't just about individual passengers, it's about trust. If people feel they're being treated unfairly, that perception can be just as damaging as the reality. Addressing these concerns openly could go a long way toward rebuilding that trust. Naomi nodded. I'm not here to attack your airline. She said, I'm here because I believe in holding systems accountable. If you're willing to acknowledge the problem, there's a chance to fix it not just for me, but for everyone. The room fell silent for a moment. The weight of Naomi's words hanging in the air. The man leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, we'll need to review this further. But I appreciate your passion. Ms. Spencer, it's clear this issue matters deeply to you. It matters to a lot of people. Naomi replied quietly. Blank. After the meeting, Naomi and Rachel walked out into the crisp evening air. The sky was streaked with shades of orange and pink, the sun dipping below the horizon. Naomi felt drained but also oddly lighter, as if the act of speaking her truth had lifted a small weight from her shoulders. They heard you, Rachel said, breaking the silence. They won't admit it yet. But they heard you. Naomi nodded. I hope so. But even if they don't act, this isn't over. People need to know what's happening. They will, Rachel assured her. This story has legs. Between the data, the testimonies, and your voice, we'll make sure it's heard. Naomi gazed out at the horizon, her thoughts swirling. The airline representatives hadn't given any concrete answers, but their unease had been enough to tell her that the fight wasn't in vain. Change wouldn't come easily, it rarely did, but she was willing to keep pushing. As they walked toward the parking lot, Naomi felt a quiet determination settle over her. She thought of all the passengers who had experienced the same subtle exclusions. The same quiet reminders that they didn't belong. She thought of Clara, of Rachel, of everyone who had helped her see the bigger picture. The journey wasn't over, but Naomi knew she was no longer walking it alone. And that, she realized, was a victory in itself. The courtroom was quiet but charged with anticipation. Naomi sat near the front, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her journal resting beside her. The room was packed, a mix of journalists, passengers, and airline representatives, all gathered to witness what had become a public reckoning for the industry. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. Rachel sat next to her, a calm but focused presence. She had been instrumental in getting the story to this point, her investigative series sparking a wave of public outcry. Now, the issue had reached the ears of lawmakers, prompting this hearing to address the mounting evidence of systemic bias in air travel. At the front of the room, a panel of senators and transportation officials sat in a row, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. The airline's legal team was seated to the side, their carefully neutral expressions betraying none of the tension Naomi knew they must be feeling. When Naomi's name was called, she rose and walked to the witness stand. Her heart pounded, but her steps were steady, her posture straight. She had prepared for this moment, replaying it in her mind over and over. Now, it was time to speak. Blank. The first question was simple. Ms. Spencer, can you describe your experiences as a frequent flyer? Naomi nodded, her voice steady. I've traveled extensively for work, logging hundreds of thousands of miles with the same airline. I hold gold status, which, in theory, qualifies me for certain benefits like upgrades. But in practice, I've consistently found myself excluded from those opportunities. What do you believe is the cause of this exclusion? I believe there's a bias, whether intentional or not, built into the system. Over time, I've observed that passengers who receive upgrades or preferential treatment often fit a certain profile. They're typically white, male, and perceived as more important passengers. A murmur rippled through the audience. But Naomi kept her gaze steady. Can you provide specific examples? One senator asked. Naomi opened her journal, the pages marked with careful notes. She described her experiences, each one delivered with precision and clarity. The denied upgrades, the subtle dismissals, the quiet but persistent reminders that her presence wasn't valued in the same way as others. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then another senator leaned forward. Ms. Spencer, what do you hope to achieve by sharing your story? Naomi took a breath, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the stand. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for fairness, for transparency, for a system that doesn't quietly exclude people based on factors they can't control. This isn't just about me, it's about creating a better experience for everyone. Blank. Blank. After Naomi's testimony, other witnesses were called. Clara, the flight attendant, shared her perspective, recounting her observations of how bias played out in subtle but consistent ways. Oliver, the business traveler Naomi had met at the gate months ago, admitted that he hadn't noticed the disparities until Naomi pointed them out. Privilege is invisible when you're the one benefiting from it, he said, his voice tinged with regret. Rachel presented the data she had collected, each statistic a stark reminder of the disparities that had gone unchecked for years. The numbers were undeniable, painting a clear picture of systemic inequality. The airline's representatives attempted to defend their policies, but their arguments felt hollow in the face of the evidence. They spoke of algorithms and policies, insisting that any bias was unintentional. But as the hearing progressed, it became clear that the public and the panel were no longer satisfied with excuses. Blank. By the end of the day, the room had shifted. What began as a tense and uncertain hearing had transformed into something else, a collective acknowledgement that change was necessary. The senators pledged to investigate further, to push for reforms that would bring accountability and fairness to the airline industry. As the hearing adjourned, Naomi stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air. The crowd had dispersed, but a few reporters lingered, their cameras and microphones aimed at her. She answered their questions briefly, her words measured but hopeful. This wasn't the end of the story. She knew it was just the beginning. Rachel joined her, a quiet smile on her face. You were incredible in there, she said. Naomi nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't just me. It was everyone, the stories, the data, the voices that came together. That's how change happens, Rachel said, one step at a time. Naomi looked out at the bustling street, the world moving forward as it always did. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of possibility, a belief that the system could change, even if slowly. As she walked away from the courthouse, her journal tucked under her arm, Naomi felt the weight of her journey lift slightly. There was still work to be done, but she no longer carried it alone. The winds were shifting, and she was ready to move with them. The fight wasn't over, but the path ahead felt just a little clearer. And for Naomi, that was enough.